everybody. Let me welcome you to this webinar. It's organised by the Living Maps Network under the general title Just Maps. Before we start, just a few sort of housekeeping things to kind of go through. So we've got a very interesting set of presentations tonight. And we hope that you'll use the chat facility to, as we go through, if you've got questions or comments or just points of information, please do use the chat facility, which we'll be sort of monitoring as we go. And there'll be a question and answer session at the end, and we'll obviously go back and we'll address those comments and contributions. So don't hold back on that. I should also let you, we're recording the event, and there's an edited version of it which will be posted on our website about a week or 10 days after the event. I know some people unfortunately couldn't make it tonight, so it is being recorded. There is also a transcription facility for people who need that. I think you have to indicate that you do want to use it, but it's there for you if you do. Right, well, so tonight's event is entitled Owning the Map, Indigenous Cartographies on the Front Line of Climate Change. And it's nothing if not topical. I'm sure you're all too aware that, this discussion is taking place at a moment of great peril, not just for Europe, but with the threat of unilateral use of nuclear weaponry for the whole planet. And not for the first time in this century, we're watching cities and civilian populations being attacked and destroyed in the name of liberating them. Yet at the same time, we're facing a multilateral threat to human existence on the planet, one also animated by imperious dreams of domination, in which the logic of winner takes all governs the actions of governments and corporations. Our continued dependence on fossil fuel economies has forged a direct link between the geopolitics of the Ukraine conflict and an international world order which still seems incapable of mobilizing its vast resources to effectively combat climate change. One of the more hopeful aspects of COP26, which in other respects perhaps was a strenuous exercise in greenwashing by said governments and corporations, one of the more hopeful aspects was the presence of representatives from indigenous communities, mostly from the global south, who allied themselves with climate activist movements in advanced capitalist countries to create a platform of radical address and challenge. As radical cartographers, we're all too aware of the historical connection between map making and war making, especially in the colonial context. In Britain, after all, we have what's still called the Ordnance Survey as the main provider of official maps of the country. At the same time, there's widespread search for creative alternatives to scientific cartography, as represented today by, ubiquitous sat-navs and Google Maps. Ethnographers, artists, and community activists have been in the forefront of experimenting with new forms of mapping, which remain embedded in everyday life and are always embodied relationship to other people and to environments where we work, live, and play. As part of this, there's been an increasing interest in indigenous cartographies, customary forms of mapping by communities which until recently didn't have access to GIS or other digital kind of technologies to represent the way they actually live their spatiality. These indigenous mappings articulate a radically different relationship of map to territory, of culture to nature, than found in Western cartography, and indeed put those dualisms into question. At the same time, of course, these communities find themselves on the front line of climate change. So the question arises, what can radical cartographers and climate activists in the technologically advanced countries learn from these indigenous communities? What alliance, if any, is now possible between these two groups, separated and linked as they are by the whole history of colonialism and Western imperialism, in which our maps have been used to misunderstand and legitimate the seizure of their territory? To address this issue, we're fortunate today in having a speaker who's made this issue a central concern of his life's work, both as a historian and a documentary filmmaker, work moreover which explores both sides of that equation. Alan Ereira began his career as a producer of history programs for schools radio at the BBC, and that included a documentary of the Battle of the Somme, which won top international awards. Recently, he's written a biography of John Ogilby, a 17th century dancer, impresario, and mapmaker, who created the first map of Britain with roads on it. And he's just completed the Midas Touch, which he describes as a history of the gold delusion. It was while he was researching a film about the Spanish Armada that he began his relationship with the Kogi, an indigenous community in Colombia, and it's the collaboration which over a considerable period of time resulted in 2 films, some extracts of which he's going to show us this evening. Alan is now working on a multidisciplinary project under UNESCO auspices. Yes, UNESCO still exists, to bring academic scientists to work with and learn from the Kogi on how best to take care of the land. After his presentation, which will last about 50 minutes, Alan will be in discussion with 2 leading environmentalists. Bob Gilbert, who's a member of the Living Maps board and whose most recent book, Ghost Trees, got reviews which some of us could only dream about, and Candace Fujikane, author of Mapping Abundance for a Planetary Future, and whose brilliant presentation in our webinar series a couple of months ago, I think many of you hopefully have seen. So we're in for a real delight tonight, I think, addressing some really frontline questions. So at this point, I'd like to hand over to Alan to start the proceedings.
Oh, well, thank you very much. Hi. Well, I will simply try and get this show on the road. This is a trace of Mama Luntana, a traditional leader of the Kogi people. They live in a region of northern Colombia, officially labeled the Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta. It's a small tectonic plate that collided with South America, producing a triangular pyramid nearly 5 miles high, a microcosm of the planet, including rainforest, desert and tundra, rising directly out of the tropical Caribbean to Arctic glaciers. The Kogi call this steep, difficult massif the heart of the world. The purpose of their existence is to care for it, the massif, and by extension, the world. Their ancestors, who the Spanish called Tyrona, had large, well-built cities linked by an elaborate web of paths and stairs, and they mapped this land. But the lines on this pre-Columbian mapstone do not represent those roads or paths. They had no reason to do that, nor did the map makers of anywhere else. No one before the 17th century used a map to find their way on land. These lines do not show anything visible in the material world, but they can be followed by those who know how. The port of Santa Marta, founded in 1525 on Tyrona land, was the first Spanish city on the American continent. This is part of an atlas by Philip II's cosmographer, Juan Martinez, drawn in 1582. Its purpose was to indicate the sea route to gold, and the cosmographer was in charge of the secret master chart, the Padron Real, the royal register. Behind Santa Marta are the mountains of the Sierra. Europeans here saw what they wanted to see, a new world, new Spain, a blank canvas, whose inhabitants were to be dispossessed and swept aside. The only settlements on the map are new creations flagged as Spanish. In 1582 there were older, larger and better built cities here, but they were indigenous. In 1600 these were completely destroyed, and the inhabitants who didn't escape were slaughtered or enslaved. This stairway to nothing is a relic of a well-built Tyrona city now called Pueblito. There were survivors, refugees who fled into high valleys where they vanished. So by 1630, European map makers saw this as a land without indigenous people. This is a Dutch map to help the Dutch West India Company capture a share of the profit. The Sierra Nevada now seemed very distant from Santa Marta. Indigenous memory was officially obliterated and irrelevant to European sea wolves. Yet the descendants of the Tyrona had rebuilt their lives in the high hidden valleys. The Sierra contained an entire lost civilization, still functioning. They identified as 4 lineages, Kagaba, Ika, Sanka, and Kanguamo. This is a town of the Kagaba, or Kogi. They had continued here because they believed they had the responsibility of caring for the mountain and so for the life of the whole planet. They offer one of the best remaining windows into the pre-colonial mind. With no written language, they carefully preserve their ancestral oral teachings, practices, and knowledge of history and nature. They call the non-indigenous below their younger brothers, ignorant, dangerous, and greedy. Our specialism is plunder, careless of damage, exemplified by the plunder of Tyrona tombs in search of gold. In the late 1980s, Colombia publicized the discovery of a large Tyrona lost city, older than Machu Picchu. Archaeological surveys had failed to see it. Tomb robbers had stumbled on it just 26 kilometers from Santa Marta and looted it. The BBC asked me to see if I could make a documentary about it. The tomb robbers found the jungle here so dense and steep, they called the region hell. That was when I heard about the Kogi. Here was a unique opportunity to learn about a pre-Columbian city they would be able to interpret, and no one had asked them. As it happened, I'd heard they were very worried and wanted to try to speak to us, so I offered an invitation. If you want to speak to the world, I can help you. They analyzed my message, and after a year, I was invited to explain how.
In the beginning, the Great Mother divided up the earth. She sent you far away, far away, far away. And in this place, she put us. Then the younger brother came back again to this side of the world. He came back again. And he started to destroy, and he started to kill us. So now you've reached here. The younger brother is at the gate of the elder brother. Younger brother climbs, and we retreat before him. He has taken our lands below, but the lands above are closed to you. Still, he keeps on coming and trying to get in here. So now he must stop, right here. Isn't that what the mother said?
Just once. You will come through the gate.
From their high inaccessible places, they had watched us becoming ever more destructive, so that their own hidden work was no longer effective. They'd realized that their policy of silence and isolation must end, and they must stop us from unknowingly causing the world to die. That was why I'd been given access. They're guardians of knowledge, especially trained women and men. The women are sagas, meaning the moon, and speak for our Luna. I was kept at a distance from sagas. Their male equivalents are called mama, meaning the sun. They would speak more directly.
I'm here. We all are here to give a warning. I'm speaking on behalf of us all, to send out a message to all the younger brothers, and I'm going to have to say it in a way that they can understand. Not just a message for the men who've come, and whatever place, wherever it is they've come from. Not just for the men who've come. I want the whole world to listen to the warning that we speak to you.
The Great Mother gave us what we needed to live, and her teaching has not been forgotten right up to this day. We all still live by it. But now they are taking out the mother's heart. They are digging up the ground and cutting out her liver and her guts. The mother is being cut to pieces and stripped of everything. From their first landing they have been doing this.
We work to take care of the world, but they are ending.
So from today, stop digging into the earth and stealing the gold. If you go on, the world will end. You are bringing the world to an end.
Yes, what would they think if all we mamas died? Would they think? So what? What would they think? If that happened and all we mamas died and there was no one doing our work, well, the rain wouldn't fall from the sky. It would get hotter and hotter from the sky, and the trees wouldn't grow and the crops wouldn't grow. Or am I wrong and they would grow anyway?
What is this work they do and we do not? It revolves around making what they call offerings or payments to redress imbalances, and these require full conscious engagement with what they perceive as the mind inside nature.
The mamas are raised from birth for 18 years in the dark, taught a dense syllabus of myth, history, natural science, medicine, and politics, and trained to connect with and serve the mind inside nature. Here, Mama Luntana is looking into a pool where he has made that connection and made an offering. He speaks no Spanish and has no writing. In his language, the same word is used for water and spirit. Of course, you are not seeing the mama, but the trace of what was in the water, existing in spirit. That is what he understands to be all around him, the fleeting material trace of reality.
In the beginning there was blackness, only the sea. In the beginning there was no sun, no moon, no people. In the beginning there were no animals, no plants, only the sea. The sea was the mother. The mother was not people. She was not anything. Nothing at all. She was when she was. Spirit. She was memory and possibility. She was Haluna.
Where does the idea of Earth come from? Where do we get the idea of water? Why do we have a word for it? These things were conceived in the beginning, before the dawning. These were ideas, water and earth. We can only have ideas of things that have already been conceived in a luna. Before the dawning, before there was anything, we were conceived in the water of a luna. So were the trees, the mountains, everything.
And then the mother began to spin out her thoughts. She heaped up a spindle before the dawning, and the mother spun 9 worlds. She gave birth to 9 daughters. Each world had its own color, and she gave birth to sons, the lords of creation. One was Saranque, and then she wondered, how would we create a living thing? It was hard to understand how to make a human,
The mother and her children had to think very hard. How does an eye work? How does a foot work? And when it was done, the 9th world was peopled. But this was before the dawning. There was still no people, no plants, no animals, no sun. Only the mother, only Aluna.
The world still existed only as thought in the consciousness of the mother. The act of creation was a separation or withdrawal of the mother. As one teacher explained to me, there was a flat cloth, the cloth is uncreated, black, then a corner of the cloth was lifted, separating the cloth below from the cloth above. And in the newly opened space between was material reality, the physical world we inhabit, the present. This space is not the cloth, it is not filled with the mother's thought, but reveals a trace of it. The material world is illuminated. The whole cloth I was to understand as the whole of the mother's thought. The separation of below from above was the separation of the future from the past. The younger brother sees the space between, the present, as all there is. The land is traced on filaments of the cloth, invisible threads of thought, shikwakala. These filaments are analogous to nerves, veins, arteries, which also connect the earth to the rest of the universe. Some are physically manifest in natural paths, the surface flow of water. Others are underground flows and the roots of winds and clouds. Some reveal themselves in the movement of animals and birds. They are, in a sense, song lines, and the threads of reality were spun in thought and song before there was light. This song follows the first thread. It's the song of Genesis. The thread flows through humans and is traced in music and dance. It's a connection to geography and the original law that defines everything from gravity through plant and animal nature to human society. This man held my head and taught me to dance before I could be trusted to begin my work with them. You should not need training to understand the world. Every Kogi toddler is ready to enter society when they can dance. Dancing is said to come before walking, and that is where connection begins. When Kogi mamas and sagas look at the illuminated material landscape, they see it as the trace of the thought world of Aluna. As an experiment, they were asked to look at a landscape in France and show how the ideas within it might be represented in visible form. What emerged was this representation of the invisible thought of the dynamic flow of water, air and influence, which the Kogi perceived beneath the drome's illuminated skin. Particular sites, represented symbolically by appropriate shells, were identified as having a function and a mission, each linked to a type of ecosystem or species of animals or plants. They speak of the whole world structured in this way. Then they helped with painting what they saw as the visible, illuminated trace of the ideas that shaped this landscape. The prominences were described as having different levels of authority, which controlled the movement of animals and water. These turned out to be good descriptions of what happens on this land that they had never seen before. The terrain is not an inert subject to be traversed and exploited, it's a living, feeling body. In Kogi cosmography, everything is part of everything else, as every part of a hologram is present throughout the whole. We simply don't grasp the world in the same way. For them, the living massif is an entity that's a process in time. Gona Indua. It begins with go, anticipation, continues na, the pre-dawn light, which we call astronomical dawn, and then win, the first movement of life in the womb, and ends in dua, meaning the burst of ejaculation across the heavens called the Milky Way, and also meaning every tiny form of life on Earth and in the sea, and a generic term for shells. Gono Indua is not a thing with edges, but a narrative in 4 dimensions. The visible material structure is a trace of a luna, but was created by separation. A luna's consciousness still has to be accessed from this material space from which it was withdrawn. That's made possible by what they call black lines. They are understood as invisible fissures, gaps in reality, where the underlying consciousness may be directly accessed. There are special places called eswamas, nodal points on these lines. Eswama literally means number 1 hot. The black lines of the Sierra have been carefully mapped on stones at the eswamas, showing how points high inland connect to points on the shore. Information flows between these places, and that's crucial to the Mama's work. The physical structure of the cosmos and the mountain massif is expressed and mapped in the Nuhwe, the World House. There is one at every accessible eswama, and it's where Kogi men hold their meetings and ceremonies. It's a place to listen to the mamas. In here, men are inside the mountain. Its structure extends into past and future, the sky vault and the abyss. The Nuhwe maps the 9 worlds onto its structure, 4 as rings that support the roof, 4 more in the underworld. Its middle is the floor, the earth we inhabit, completing the 9 worlds of creation. They are also the 9 months of gestation. 4 fires mark the cardinal points and mirror the lineages. 2 opposite doors provide the entrance from and exit to the material world.
Saki ai mi ke via kuna laki ai zuqabalat zagana uni hubaleti mawalde mi ke via ave nuqama quzaki huzi mayate kyaba mi ke via pana shqagakwe aini magazahecha gwapanekhan Eizwa luna muleto gyaba migabaina khasa hwa bagztana ainu kha ijigztu azkhaita wako Eikimi khalege togechiga gako aituhe jawa zana na migahon gwajini ni aiga ma hawkhazigaya na lagale Saimon teze ge chigarna ni kha mia tune na zaka aina haw ay khatoni ma ulok shagwe khanki saikugwa sakhanga basu sumimi ga hongo ziniki miawati enyi mare Aikimi Haleshi, any Yoshinga, Magazahacha go to Gochigana ya. Gakoichi, Gakui Sabi Makozira Yaga, Stia Nawa Jawa Heni Kurazim Nukama Kozini Jina.
Offerings are made by concentrating and connecting with a luna, the consciousness which underpins space and time. They navigate through the world using a completely different set of coordinates from us and hearing it speak to them. So the job of the Mama is to strive to comprehend, by concentration and observation, his place in the laws that shape the ideas manifested in reality. He participates in the laws of nature. Serious work must be done at an Eswama, a location with what the Kogi call authority. The same word means human political authority, but this is part of nature. It's also a place where humans and the world connect. Humans, in the Kogi perspective, are embedded in nature. Some mamas, like this one, are on permanent duty all their lives to perform the work needed at a particular Eswama. There is no possible separation between them and the mountain. They live in symbiosis with the body of the earth. The Kogi understand all life in terms of balance between masculine and feminine. All features of the world are gendered, and imbalance has immediate physical consequences. The ancient Chinese theory of acupuncture has a similar philosophy, yin and yang, and claims that energy flows between them in the body along invisible channels. The energy, called qi, has to follow a specific pathway, and a small interference in its flow, by the insertion of a very fine needle, can correct an imbalance at its destination. The Kogi management of nature using Eswamas could be appropriately described as earth acupuncture. The land itself is a living body, and the mapstone is in a sense a medical chart of, I think, the ideas within one face of the pyramid. The fatal attack on the living body, from the mama's perspective, began in the 1970s, when Colombia decided that it was time to develop Santa Marta. The engineer who laid a major highway right along the coast did not know that he was cutting these threads, and when Kogi appeared to explain, the efforts of these bewildering superstitious illiterates were incomprehensible. The effects were first seen at the west end of the road. Cienega Grande was one of the world's greatest mangrove swamps. Very quickly the forest became a graveyard, everything was dying, and the Kogi's terrified explanations were ignored. The Sierra was now to be confronted with mega projects. The next was a huge coal-fired power station right on a coastal Eswama. It sits on the estuary of a river that flows down from the snow peaks. The Kogi tried to explain that this would not just destroy a piece of land, it would destroy the river right up to its source, change the evaporation of the land, and raise the temperature, destroying a whole series of habitats. They understood the connecting threads. They were correct. The land has dried out. It was essential to speak to the world. They needed my offer. They spoke in 1990. Now we know. We didn't then.
Humans need water. They have to have water to live. The earth is the same. It was made perfect by Saranqua, but now it is weak and diseased. The animals die, the trees dry up, people become ill. Many new illnesses will appear. There will be no cure or medicine for them. And the reason is that younger brother is violating fundamental principles continually and totally. Drilling, mining, extracting petrol, minerals, stripping away the world. This is destroying all order and damaging the world. BBC, tell the younger brother, open your eyes. Hear the mama's law and story, learn how things really are.
They expected that once we grasped that we are killing the world, we would stop. They were, of course, quite mistaken. They had to protect the land, but they had no language to do that. Even if their maps had been portable, they showed connections that made no sense to people who cannot see what is under nature's skin. When Europeans first met the Tyrona in the 16th century, their way of knowing the world would not have seemed so strange. This engraving of 1559 shows Ptolemy singing of the wandering moon and the labours of the sun. The same laws that kept the stars in their courses were the foundation of worldly authority, natural and political. In Britain, that meant the Commonwealth and common sense, the common man and the commons of England. They formed a harmony with the heavens themselves. Up to the mid-17th century, nobility, philosophers and lawyers stepped together to the music of the spheres. That was what dancing what were called the old measures was said to be how lawyers physically participated in the inner law of the world, which governed men and nature. The common law they were taught was not invented by kings or parliaments. It was the law inherent in the world from time immemorial, which lawyers learned to understand and interpret. John Ogilby was a young dancing master at Gray's Inn, instructing trainee lawyers in the steps that connected them to cosmic harmony. But that world ended, turned upside down in the 1640s. The earth itself was hurled from the axis of the heavens, political authority disintegrated. Everything changed in a new age of intellectual challenge, man-made law, and the growth of military power. After the horrors of civil war and the outlawing of the rebels, came plague and the destruction of England's capital. The old cosmology was dead, and the dance revels were dead and buried. John Ogilby had moved to being a theatrical impresario, then a self-taught translator of Latin and Greek classics, and once commerce revived with the restoration of atlases of the continents. He started publishing translations of Dutch atlases to sell to merchants. His Atlas of America for English imperialists in 1671 was a direct rip-off from the Dutch map of 1630. Mapping as an aid to seizing territory, with the history of the inhabitants wiped out. Hold on to that thought. European maps were generally celebrations of the heritage of the inhabitants, decorative vehicles for storytelling, royal and noble history. John Speed's county maps, published in 1611, were not referred to as cartography, but as chorography, the stories of places, in this case places in Hampshire. They were published as the theatre of the Empire of Great Britain, connecting people, land, history, and the kingdom, a narrative performed in 4 dimensions and told without roads. The largest image on the page shows Empress Maud's escape from the Battle of Winchester back in 1141, carried out in a bier, pretending to be dead. It's a fairy story with no place on our idea of a map, but then roads had no place on this or any other European map then. Knowledge of how to get from place to place was valuable local property, and travellers paid for it. When Sam Pepys took his wife and servant on holiday in his new coach in 1668, he had to hire guides. When he tried to get from Newbury to Reading without one, he got lost. But in 1675, Ogilby changed all that completely, providing the first usable road map of a country. From now on, this would be the purpose of a map. A new kind of king had taken over, and chorography disappeared. Restoration Britain would understand land in a new way, to be opened up like America, which is why Britain needed a cosmographer royal like Spain. That was now Ogilby's job. Ogilby had been the impresario who invented, scripted and staged Charles II's coronation and set out the agenda for the kingdom that was replacing Cromwell's republic. He designed it as a Roman emperor's triumph, with 100-foot-high triumphal arches, a dazzling performance celebrating the submission of London and Britain to a new Augustus. The concept of a map for journeys through the kingdom was not an innocent one. It was meant as the instrument of royal power, as absolute as any Spanish colony. The king asked his supporters to pay the phenomenal cost of mapping the roads. Here Ogilby presents him with the loyalty list. The choice of roads is odd. There's a huge emphasis on roads that connect London to the coast, and they were not necessarily the normal routes or suitable for wheeled vehicles. Why should the frontispiece show London as a royal fortress dominating the land? It wasn't. But here, under the shadows of the guns, it shows Ogilby directing scientific cartographers. This book would enable officials to exercise power through the kingdom without being dependent on indigenous guides. In 2007, I made a series with Terry Jones for BBC Wales, trying to figure out why this had been done, what had caused the invention of a new form of scientific cartography. The answer turned out to be that Charles II wanted to refight Charles I's war on Parliament, using new tools.
In Ogilby's day, King Charles didn't have much power over his realm. England wasn't like France, where Louis XIV had power and wealth, the Sun King. But Charles had been brought up in France, in exile. And France was Catholic.
Catholicism is a language of smells, bells, pomp, hierarchy and obedience, and monarchs like all of those things. And it's no wonder that Charles himself says there's no religion in the world that matches the dignity of a king better than Catholicism.
Charles wanted the power his father had fought and died for, and he thought that becoming Catholic was part of that. Of course, that could provoke another civil war. But Louis XIV offered money and an invading army to back him. That was the secret Treaty of Dover.
The most scandalous bit of paper in English history is probably the secret Treaty of Dover, which Charles II signed with Louis XIV, 1670.
And that was the first reason why this atlas was needed, to help Charles bring in French troops and establish himself as an absolute Catholic ruler. And the map contained a mass of useful information for running Charles II's Catholic absolute monarchy.
It's absolutely true, I think, that Ogilvy's working towards the centralisation of power. He's employed by people who are mapping out a greater potential for royal government in every field.
This is a real historical discovery. Ogilby's map was part of a secret project to replace parliamentary government.
We always knew that around 1670, Charles II's government was trying to become a much stronger monarchy. Now you've given us the geographical dimension of that. It's a monarchy which is literally trying to map out its power on the land, so it can get a grip on its subjects by knowing exactly where to put its men when it wants them at any particular point.
Thanks. France was the land of reason, of fashion, and of centralised royal power. And Ogilby's atlas, I think, was part of the programme to turn Charles into another Sun King and Britain into the image of France. Oh, coming. It was the map of a future that never happened.
The roads were drawn out and carefully measured with a new scientific instrument and the help of the Royal Society. This was not the grace and poetry of dance, but the slog and clunkiness of mechanical science. Robert Hooke, the Royal Society's curator of experiments, had tried to literally reinvent the wheel with a robot walking cart. He proposed that Ogilby should hitch his road measuring wheel to a cart to speed up the work. Ogilby said that wouldn't have the accuracy. The existing map of Hampshire could not be used to find the way from Hooke's office in London to his home on the Isle of Wight. It shows Southampton, but no road from London and no ferry to the island. Hooke had more knowledge of distances on the moon than on his journey home. Ogilby's Britannia was composed of detailed strip maps of 26,000 carefully measured miles of roads at 1 inch to the mile, and gave a very different view of Hampshire, including the 78 miles of road from the Standard in Cornhill, London, to Southampton, and the ferry over to Isle of Wight. Younger brother's map is designed for journeys. Although Ogilby's idea of strip maps would not take root, roads would from now on define the very idea of a map. This is how Hampshire was seen 100 years after his work. Its towns linked by roads and rivers. That's how a place can be found and what puts it on the map. So if we look at the triangle of roads shown linking Alton, Petersfield and Alresford, there's not much in there. Speed had shown a little place called Priorsdean, but it was off the road, and so now it was off the map. Maps can lose places. Priorsdean's back on the map now because it produces an award-winning white wine. In the new cartography derived from military and colonial need, places disappeared, especially indigenous places. This French map of the Sierra from 1827 makes it clear exactly how the lost city vanished just 16 miles from Santa Marta. And here's the explorer Wollaston's map made in 1925 for the Royal Geographical Society. The Society had played a significant role in late 19th and early 20th century imperialism. And the only places in the Sierra that made it onto the map were Christian missions. When I first filmed in the Sierra in 1990, there were no usable maps. This was government policy, as they were fighting guerrillas and drug cartels, and they wanted to keep its geography hidden. This was a significant inconvenience, which became very evident when the helicopter seeking to collect my film crew from a Kogi town couldn't find us. I remember standing on a crest over a deep valley, seeing our pilot closely examining the jungle below him without a map, never looking up to where we were uselessly shouting and waving, and then he gave up. His departure was sad, very expensive, and since the guerrillas were hunting us, a bit worrying. In 2003, Colombia finally issued a map. It looks very like the map of 1925. The only communities on it are places that were settled by colonists, including the mission towns. Now, admittedly, the missionaries had been ejected by the indigenous, and the Kogi had taken them over. And there was also now a road. That was the road constructed in the 1970s that had done such an extraordinary amount of damage. Like all such maps, it doesn't show the deep connections and shows no reason why the land cannot be refashioned. The mummers looked at it and decided it was necessary to change the language of younger brother's map. That language is shaped by a grammar of things. A map is composed of representations of things, and a thing is defined by its edges. In 2017, the influential American philosopher Edward Casey published The World on Edge, stressing the importance of edges in our construction of understanding. In his earlier book on landscape painting and maps, Representing Place, he'd already noticed how that gave islands a privileged status in cartography. So mummers from all 4 indigenous tribes joined together the sacred sites at the base of black lines in their massif as though they're on the shores of an island, a thing with edges that younger brother could see. This island is Shindua, the thread of all life. To make this idea manifest in the material world, they stepped into the map, walking right around the entire massif, tracing the line. They reenacted this epic journey for the film they made in 2012 called Aluna, this time laying a gold thread all the way. It was a reinforcement of their identity by defining a limit to the Colombian conquest using immortal gold. They demanded that the line be literally put on the map to be recognized as a fissure, a boundary between worlds, the younger brother's black line. The sites on the shore have special ecological roles. This hill of Hukulwa was one that stood guard there and was described as a sentinel at the ocean with authority over many things, until 2006.
The indigenous tribes are so alarmed that they walked for days from communities on the world's highest coastal mountain to reach this site on the shore. Developers have dug a trench to drain the lagoons here, mangrove swamps teeming with life. The construction company says that building a port here is necessary for Colombia's growing mining industry and will create 5,000 new jobs.
Es un plano del esquema de ordenamiento territorial del municipio de Huilla. El sitio que ellos llaman Juculba está a 12 kilómetros del occidente de esta línea. Aquí no existen zonas de pagamento, no existen comunidades indígenas.
This is the map he holds. It's an ambivalent tribute to the Mama's achievement. It shows the black line which they created, but they marked the line on the existing Colombian map, which only showed post-Columban settlements. Indigenous sites that were not built over by colonists were not shown on the map. That allowed the construction company to helpfully add it with red felt tip at a completely different location. The Kogi are an entirely oral culture. Few can read or understand Spanish, so they were not in control of the map. But they could see the trick, and they knew the cosmography. Their line had been hijacked.
Usted que no conoce, usted que no conoce. Nosotros somos dueños, estamos reclamando. ¿Y qué hace tú?
Bueno.
De años no, de 500 años por allá.
Yo lo respeto inmensamente.
أما نقول قلت سالني جازم لي خبر لك بعد وتشغزنك ني خلاشاني ناخذك مطلشاني ناخذك قرشاتشاني ناخذك نما بعد
By now, the climate crisis was better understood, and the academic world was more responsive. Professor Paul Silito is an anthropologist and agricultural scientist, and his argument that indigenous science needs to be taken seriously came out at the same time as the Hukulwa protest. The argument of indigenous people was now being shifted into younger brothers' language, backed up by legal action and careful documentation. For the Kogi, it focused on trying to enforce the legal requirement for prior consultation and consent before damage is allowed to Eswamas. In 2010, after 4 years, prior consultation was finally insisted on by Colombia's Constitutional Court. The damage, of course, had already been done, but in the world of Aluna, of memory and possibility, this victory may have meaning. In 2013, the court ordered compliance with its ruling. In 2014, it reaffirmed the right of indigenous people to be consulted and stop the mining operation. But in 2016, the indigenous walked out of the consultation process because after 6 years, the development companies still refused to guarantee to abide by the results. And then in 2018, the Black Line, with all its protections, was incorporated into the Colombian Constitution by presidential decree. The president was immediately replaced by a very different administration. The decree became a rallying point for environmentalists, the focus of the campaign for defense of the people, the territory, and the planet. The Kogi Mamas have now overseen the creation of a book explaining the significance of the invisible threads that weave the fabric of life there, but they're so fearful of how it may be used that it remains unpublished. It makes visible the hidden links between locations connected to animals, birds, insects, snakes, winds and water, seeds and the sun, people, fire and land. Best keep it hidden, perhaps. The plunder doesn't stop. The new government wants to rub out the Black Line, and unopposed wildcat gold mining of indigenous land has replaced cocaine as the most profitable illegal activity. The purple area shows deforestation in just 1 year, 2019. What's needed now is international recognition that the indigenous have a better understanding than anyone else of sustainable guardianship of the land, and it's our interest that they should control it. That's why my own NGO, the Tyrona Heritage Trust, working with the Kogi on a new UNESCO initiative called Bridges. Bridges is intended to bring together different forms of knowledge, in this case indigenous and academic, to find new approaches to sustainability. Here's a planning meeting. The indigenous work restoring forests, rivers and degraded habitats in the foothills achieves what ours cannot. A particular example is the Waichaka River Valley, which was devastated by lowland deforestation and inefficient agriculture, then purchased by indigenous peoples. The river had almost dried up, the animals had disappeared. For more than 20 years, working on Eswamas and sacred sites, they have restored the forest, raised the river to a healthy volume, and seen the return of animal life. The new project that we're performing for Bridges aims to continue this work in coordination with academics to enable public visibility, local education of non-Indigenous communities, and publication in academic journals. This is a partnership of two fundamentally different forms of knowledge with fundamentally different purposes. It's also intended to be a demonstration of the importance of restoring their ancestral lands to the Kogi for the well-being of everyone in the region and the world. The Kogi want the lessons learned here to be transferable to achieve the best outcome for the whole world. The Kogi have now learned GPS mapping and are using it to survey the land where the project will be based. Modern satellite cartography actually helps bring Indigenous and non-Indigenous mapping closer together, as it locates places in an infinite web of invisible coordinates without reference to physical locations or route markers. The project will require administrators, forestry experts, translators, anthropologists, as well as the purchase of land and payment for meetings and site visits, software, hardware, and an outreach and reporting team. We'll need to raise over £100,000 a year for 3 years. The results, as we all know, could be of fundamental importance in this age of climate emergency.
Yes, what would they think if all we mamas died? Would they think? So what? What would they think? If that happened and all we mamas died and there was no one doing our work, well, the rain wouldn't fall from the sky. It would get hotter and hotter from the sky, and the trees wouldn't grow and the crops wouldn't grow. Or am I wrong and they would grow anyway?
So that's the presentation.
Wow, well, thank you so much, Alan. It really was a wonderful presentation. I mean, there's so much there to make us think and rethink our own culture and also the whole issue of climate change. Why people are getting their breath back and their thoughts.
I hope it was. Did the sound work in the end?
It did indeed. I'm sorry for the technical glitches, everybody.
It's my fault, I'm sure.
But it was obviously well worth waiting for the full presentation, and it came across really very well.
Good. Thank you.
So now I think we're going to turn to our two discussants, and we're delighted that Bob Gilbert and Candace Fujikane could be with us tonight. Those of you who've been involved with Living Maps, come to our events, will probably know a bit about Bob. He's a man of many parts. He's been a stand-up comedian, and we all know today that stand-up comedians can stand up for a whole lot more than just making jokes, right? So it's an important thing for us to remember at this time. He's been a community worker. He's been head of a residential field studies centre. He's been a director of sustainability at a London local authority. And above all, I think he's been a long-standing campaigner for inner city conservation and the protection of urban open spaces. Bob's books include The Green London Way. Really likes walking and really wants to kind of explore this aspect of London, then really should get hold of that book. And Ghost Trees, which I said has actually had these wonderful reviews, deservedly so. His new book is provisionally entitled The Missing Musk, and that's going to be published later this year by Scepter. And his final note is he lives in Poplar with his family, a greyhound, and several chickens. So at that point, Bob, it's over to you.
Thank you, Phil. I'm not doing any comedy tonight, just to be clear about that. And thank you, Alan, and thank you for persevering. As Phil said, thank you for persevering with those initial difficulties. It was more than worth it to see the images and hear the words, the very powerful words that you gave us. Candace and I have agreed that we're going to take it in turns to ask you questions, and Candace has asked me to go first, so that's why I'm speaking first. And I just wanted to start really by I mean, there was so much in that, and I've had the privilege also of reading it in advance, and I'm still, you know, coming to terms with the depth of all those concepts. So, first of all, I just wanted to make sure of my understanding before perhaps we go on to ask how you see the relevance of that to our own situation in the Western world. One of the things that seemed crucial to your talk was this contrast between the Kogi, have I pronounced that right? The Kogi form of map making and seeing the world, and the post-Columbian one, which was all about exploitation of resources, colonialism, and the exercise of power. So the real difference between those two. And I'm trying to get to grips with what this older, more environmental, more spiritual way of thinking and mapping, and how we can learn from it. So the threads, it seems really important, these threads of filaments that you've been to, and you've described them in so many different ways. I'm just looking at my notes. You've described them as flows, as song lines, as threads of reality, as hidden links between locations, but then connections to the natural world, filaments connecting the earth to the rest of the universe, and even threads of thought that also flow through humans, and even at one time as a medical chart. So there's so much contained within that, and I feel like I've got to spend 18 years in the dark really to understand it fully, but I haven't got 18 years left. So I wonder, coming to it yourself with your Western mind, how you understood that, and how would you express that in a way that we can really understand it, that those threads and filaments which seem central to their thoughts and their maps?
I'm not at all sure we can. Don't forget, I've spent 30 years trying to figure out what they're talking about. The notion of the word thread is fundamental to their construction of the world. They see it as being threaded, created by, it's all metaphors, of course, created by spinning a thread. They lay a thread around the Sierra. Their word for the book that they've written, it's titled in Kogi, "The Creaking of the Network of Threads Under Strain." It's everything is part of everything else, and the linkage is threads. The medical metaphor is the most useful in terms of understanding what they are trying to do. The earth is a living body. The cosmos is also a living body. The mountain is a living body. So the work they do is most easily understood, and talking about with them is most easily talked about as medical work, as trying to assist the healing of something that has become sick. And the analogy with acupuncture also helps me to understand why the kind of offerings they make, which are tiny fragments of leaf and twig and shell, brought from one place to another and placed there, the scale of the intervention is very slight, but it's the correct intervention at the right point, and that's the same as an acupuncture needle. That's the best I can offer you, but you also have to bear in mind that we have a mental framework which cannot comprehend that a thing can be more than one thing. So we cannot comprehend that by walking into a house, you are going into a mountain, for example. It's a completely different understanding of reality from ours. But its advantage, as I said early on, this notion of connectedness is like understanding the world holographically. And you know, if you take a photographic holographic plate and you break part of it off, you don't lose part of the image. You may see a lot of different fruits on the plate. You break off a section where you think there was an apple. But when you look at the plate again, the apple is still there. Everything has lost a little bit of definition and a little bit of focus, but everything is everywhere. And that's how they see the Earth.
Thank you, Alan. I mean, I particularly like those references to the Earth as a living body and to this idea of understanding different things simultaneously. I think there are a lot of links with what Candace was talking about actually when she did her previous presentation with us. So it's a good time to hand over to you, Candace.
Thank you.
Okay.
That's a really nice segue.
Oh, sorry, he wants to do introduction.
Candace, let me just introduce you.
All right. Okay.
People will know about your work and perhaps saw your presentation for us a couple of months ago. But I think, you know, one needs to say that you've really been one of the most eloquent and forceful voices arguing for an entirely different approach to climate justice. I mean, one which Alan's presentation has kind of also highlighted in terms of where it's coming from. Your book, Mapping Abundance for a Planetary Future, it certainly is about a much more positive way of arguing that native economies of abundance provide the best foundation for collective work against climate change. So we're absolutely delighted that you could join us, and I'm sure there must be lots of sort of resonances for your work that you've done in Hawaii to what Alan's been talking about, and some differences too. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Alan, I just think that is incredibly beautiful, especially the image of the shikwakala and the filaments. I think that's so beautiful. And it's so amazing to see that degree of interconnectedness, so that you see the Earth is connected to the rest of the universe, but it's also connected to the surface flow of water, the movement of animals and birds. And I thought that was particularly beautiful and very relevant to the ways that Kanaka Maoli here are engaging in cartography. And so I was thinking of my question in terms of, you know, thinking about modes of production and capitalist modes of production versus indigenous economies of abundance. And I'm thinking about Henri Lefebvre's argument that modes of mapping space reflect modes of production. So that, so he argues that capitalist mapping involves fragmentation, alienation, which is precisely what you're talking about in this presentation. And it was just really striking to me to think about Ogilby's maps of roads as reflecting a kind of capitalist economy of commerce. It's a mapping of commerce. It's a mapping of capital. And by contrast, thinking about the ways that in a capitalist economy, mapping is produced in ways that reflect markets or revolve around markets, versus the ways that for Kanaka Maoli, the mapping revolves around an ahupua'a system, which is a land division that stretches from the mountains to the outer edges of the reef, which is actually a mapping of the growing of food, the growth of food. So it's an economy that feeds versus say a capitalist economy, which produces hunger, produces unmet needs, produces desire in order to create markets. So I was thinking about that, and so there are those kinds of interesting similarities. And when you talked about the connectedness, I thought for Kanaka Maoli, the mapping is of ecosystems. And that's exactly kind of what I see like with the Shikwakala system, which is a mapping of interconnected ecological systems, so that you cannot extricate any one particular system. And that's why a devastating kind of harmful development project will create an imbalance that affects everything. So I wanted you to kind of comment a little bit on that question about these filaments and thinking about them as interlocking ecological systems. But even beyond that, I think you're also talking about sound and chants and songs, and perhaps that is part of the healing element of this kind of mapping system. How do you map the healing of the earth? And for Kanaka Maoli, there's a similar kind of argument about the importance of chants as the vibration of a human voice that resonates with the vibrations in the natural world. But anyway, it's kind of a big question. I just kind of saw this really interesting way in which the thoughts were kind of coalescing around how do you map your conception of the world?
I think what you're saying makes complete sense. I think there is nothing unique about the Kogi understanding. I think it is a universal human understanding, and somehow we've destroyed that universal human consciousness. And that, I think, is what was going on in the 17th century in Europe. The relationship of singing to the threads and to healing is terribly important. I've been taught about the use of song in medicine by a Kogi Mama, who explained how he follows the song to the source of the illness, which I think is not uncommon in other indigenous peoples. And I've also participated in Peru in medical ceremonies with ayahuasca, which involve reshaping the vision around a sick person by singing and healing and changing the shape of the problem that he is enmeshed in by the song. So song is terribly important. Music is terribly important as a way of placing your feet on the right path, without getting distracted by seeing things that lead you off in the wrong direction. And the 18 years in the dark is a really important element in this. This is one of the places where things become very strange, of course. I mean, not every indigenous community puts people into the dark from birth for 18 years. Although there seems to be some evidence that the Druids did, and that a lot of Druid teaching was conducted in the dark in a similar way, and that you learned to sing narratives in the dark, and that was part of that training. So it's a mistake to see the Kogi as being localized, is part of what I'm saying. And they don't want to see localized. And when they were looking for a way to speak to the world at the time of we made that second film, they were trying to think of how they could express the fact that they were not talking about something that was specific to a place and to a people in a place. So they said, let's make this film at the top of Mount Everest. They didn't know enough about Mount Everest to understand that that was going to be a problem. And I had to point out that by the time any of them got to the top of Mount Everest, if they could do it, they would not look like Kogi anymore, because they would obviously be dressed in like any other Everest climbers, and they would lose their identity. So that wasn't such a clever idea, but you see what they were getting at, that they wanted to establish, this is not, yes, we're talking about our mountain, but our mountain is every mountain. Our place is every place. Our house is every house. Which creates problems for map making.
Alan, I mean, I'm very interested to hear you say that Kogi thought is not unique and that there is a universal thread to it. And a lot of my work has actually been about trying to recover in an English context and in an urban context in particular, those links between our understanding of place, our environment, our place in it, our folklore and our social beliefs. And it kind of leads me to put you the question, the same questions I put to Candace actually at the end of her really interesting presentation on Hawaiian indigenous beliefs. And it's the kind of so what question in a way. You almost at the very end, you said that Kogi want these lessons to be transferable.
Absolutely.
So the question is simply, are they? I mean, having worked with them for 30 years, how would you see? I mean, what ways can these Kogi concepts be actually delocalized? How can they be applied in a Western world with a very different frame of thought?
There are two things. The first is that we have to find within our own culture and our own selves those elements which connect and which help us to understand the world in the way the Kogi see it. And quite often when I've been talking to groups in the UK about this, I emphasize, for example, that there are a lot of things that people are reluctant to talk about because they feel that they would be regarded as being soppy or unscientific, but they're actually the basis of their understanding of the world. So, for example, the way in which people understand what they're doing when they're gardening is the relationship between people and their gardens is very similar to the Kogi relation to land. They don't see that the garden is not something that they are exploiting in a commercial way. On the other hand, often they want to keep it very healthy to supply themselves with some food. And that's a proper indigenous approach. But also they see the garden as a totality, and they're very conscious that if you change one thing over here, it will change something else over there. And it is not a commercial relationship to land. It's a different relationship to land. That's one thing. The other is learning how to read the land. And that's something that they want to teach us how to do, which is why they were interested in doing what they did in France, in the Drôme. And they're getting into that more and more. Both teaching us how to read the land and also teaching us how to understand what our own monuments are about. I have taken Kogi to Stonehenge and particularly to Stonehenge and to Avebury. And let them walk around and explain the sites to me. Not that they've ever seen them before or knew anything about them, but they can still recognize them and they can still explain them and they can show me things in this, over here you will find this. Now, up here, that's an offering point. And they'll put their fingers in a hole that I didn't know was there. And there it is, indeed, that's an offering point. There are places, what the stones are, who the stones are, why they're there, is something that comes naturally to people who are used to the notion of this kind of stone. You don't have to know the place. There's a whole lot of things that they can talk to us about that make sense to us without them even knowing anything about where we are. And that's one of the things that we're going to be exploring.
I love that connection to gardening, actually. That it reminded me of a story. There's a story of St. Francis. He was hoeing his beans when one of his followers came to him and said, "What would you do if you knew you were going to die today?" And he said, "I would hoe my beans." So that kind of real relationship with the land that you get through that is wonderful. But Candace, I'm talking and it's your turn again to ask a question.
No, I love that. I love that question because it was really striking to me in, I watched the documentary Aluna, and there was a moment where the astronomer showed the Kogi the map of space, and the Kogi pointed exactly to the only star on the map and was able to identify that as the star. And the astronomer said, "Yes, that's the only star on this map."
Yes, the others were all galaxies and clusters, but they look like points of light. Yes.
I thought that was so amazing. So I was thinking about that, and I was thinking about star maps. So for us in Hawaii, one of our big fights is to protect Mauna Kea, which is a sacred mountain, from the construction of the 30-meter telescope, which proposes to dig out 1,728,000 cubic feet of earth. And it's a sacred mountain. And I remember there was also a discussion of that kind of excavation and that kind of extractivism in your presentation. So where they are locating the TMT, they say there is no, it's in an empty space, right? But it's an empty space in the middle of 263 shrines and altars.
Yeah.
So it is kind of like that kind of a cartography of capital, where the state only looks at individual sites instead of understanding the entire summit as a complex. So distributional archaeology, they would look at it as a complex rather than as individual sites. And that's what the archaeologist who supported Kanaka Maoli, because she is Kanaka Maoli, she is indigenous, she argued that they should have used a distributional method of mapping the summit. So I'm kind of thinking about that because, and what the practitioners were saying is that the sites on the summit reflect, they're actually star maps. They reflect what you see in the sky. So where the shrines are placed, they reflect the sky. And I know that's also common in maybe in different South American tribes as well. But it is that kind of a problem, right? Of mapping space such that you can look to what looks to be an empty space in the middle of these lines of energy. So putting it in the middle would be an even greater disruption of these kinds of energies. And the practitioners were arguing that because the TMT had started some construction work, that year, the water on the mountain dried up. The mountain is also the primary source of water for the island of the Hawaii Island. So they made a direct connection, cause and effect between the construction of the telescope and the shrinking of the lake that's at the summit down to from 300, I don't know, it's like, I don't know, 300 feet across down to 1 foot across, that kind of shrinkage. Yeah. So anyway, I was thinking about that in terms of how in the Hukowa protest that you talked about, that was very striking, how they were able to use the maps that the Kogi had mapped out against them. So you could talk a little bit about the Hukowa protest, because I thought that was amazing.
Yeah, it really, the Kogi keep being over optimistic about us. Just as when they made the first film, The Warning, they thought, oh, you don't know you're destroying the world, so if we tell you you're destroying the world, you'll stop destroying the world. It was a fundamental misunderstanding of who they were speaking to. And when they established the Black Line and drew it onto a map of the Colombian government, it really didn't occur to them that the government and big business would only see the defined names on the line as places at all. And the rest of the line was just up for grabs. And the fact that there were sites on that rest of the line, which were not part of the Colombian language mapping of the territory, exposed them. So that was what pushed the indigenous into the use of GPS mapping. We can't use places. We have to use coordinates for everything. And this is this begins to bring it closer to their own understanding, of course, of how places are strung together, because relationships to actually satellites, every spot on the Earth is related to a number of satellites. That's more like the mapstone. It's invisible lines, so that they've been using that pretty effectively. The real problem, of course, is that all this is a charade, isn't it? I mean, whatever arguments you come up with, whatever scientific justifications you come up with, however good your arguments are and how much you overthrow the other side's arguments, it was never really about that. It was about power and the desire to take possession. And everything else is simply the language charade that's played out.
Yeah. Yeah. So I have a follow-up question. How will their future mapping projects be different with the use of GPS mapping?
Well, for example, when they've been supplying me with maps of the optional territories where we're going to install the project that we're talking about. And these maps no longer use anything related to the existing maps of Colombia. They are purely in terms of geospatial coordinates. And everything they've given me has been simply a set of coordinates, which they find easier to understand. What they are avoiding, of course, is actually using the maps in that book, one of which I showed you, which are maps of power. Because if you know where the lines of connection really are and what those lines represent, and what the power is that flows along each, because each is very specific. It's a specific place with a specific connection to something living. And they're very scared, and this is one of the problems that face them all the time. If the knowledge they reveal is power, and that power will be used destructively. Obviously, if commercial enterprises have those maps, they may do all kinds of things with them. I mean, there's so much that goes on that's so frightening. A few years ago, there was a medical mission went into the Sierra from Hoffman-La Roche, offering, because infections come in from the outside world. And there was a wave of hepatitis infections. And they were offering injections to deal with the hepatitis. And this was a free gift to the indigenous people. And then they left with vials full of blood, which they analyzed and used what they found to produce new medicines, which they copyrighted. And their argument after that was that the indigenous people did not own the blood in their bodies. It was owned by Hoffman-La Roche. So that was the end of any kind of approach. So, for example, during the pandemic, there's been no question of anybody giving injections or vaccines to the indigenous, because they regard it's another opportunity to steal from them. That makes life quite complicated.
Thank you. That's another shocking story of exploitation, isn't it? It's like the copywriting of seeds and then the production of infertile seeds, so that indigenous people can't grow their own crops. Phil, I'm assuming we can go on until you will indicate at some stage.
Phil, keep on going. You've got questions. I've got a couple of questions of my own. I'll just throw a couple of questions in.
Let me ask this one, Phil. Just let me do one more, if you wouldn't mind, because it's a bit of a lighter one. I was fascinated by the fact that the Kogi made you dance before they. I mean, I'm tempted to ask you to demonstrate, but you also said, I love this, that the Kogi saw dancing as a way of understanding the world, and then the way you related that to the dance of the spheres and the old measures at the Inns of Court. I mean, so the question is, do you think we should all dance more?
Oh, there's no question about that. How can you doubt it? Of course we should all dance more. When my film crew were with me on making the first film, they entertained themselves. We were given Kogi houses to live in. They entertained themselves by setting up a disco in the Kogi house that they were living in. They even brought a glitter ball with them. I got terribly worried, because what was happening, of course, was that the children from toddler up were all coming in and joining in the dancing in the disco with my film crew. And I thought, this is terrible. We are corrupting this society. And then I saw the mothers who were really enthusiastic about this and bringing their children to participate in the dancing. And they thought that because we were dancers, we were okay. This was deeply reassuring to them, which I thought was interesting. I was very surprised.
Thank you, Alan. Phil, I interrupted you rather rudely. Carry on.
No. I was well, just in terms of dancing, it did occur to me that people have described dialectical thinking as a dance of the mind, and certainly in certain kinds of dialectical thought, a thing can be itself and its opposite. So, and it does that there is a kind of tradition, a kind of oppositional tradition within Western thought, which I suppose starts with a critique from of the Enlightenment and the kind of Descartes and the mind-body dualism, and then splitting off nature from culture, and all of that, and those tendencies have really kind of grown in the last 10 years. I mean, partly inspired by the climate crisis, to kind of rethink the whole relationship of the human and the non-human. So, for example, you have, I think they call themselves the new vitalists, who kind of gone back to Spinoza and kind of have a view of matter as being kind of alive, and or matter is energy, and kind of rethinking all that. And then there's the new animists, who kind of critique the whole kind of androcentric perspectives of not only Western philosophy but human science, and the kind of sentimental forms of anthropomorphism that go along with actually brutal forms of exploitation and cruelty towards animals and plants and so forth. So I mean, there are these currents in thought, which do, I think, influence the climate activists to an increasing extent, I think, and really involve, I mean, people coming out talking about actor network theory. I mean, it's all about, you can't understand the thing in itself, but in terms of its network of relationships with other things. Mm-hmm. So there's been this whole kind of paradigm shift in the way we think about our place in the world and our relationship to the world. And I think we shouldn't sort of underestimate that. I think, I mean, there's obviously a pushback against that. But I think it's worth recognizing that it's there. And I'm and I'd like to think what Alan thinks about that, and also Candace and Bob. And just finally on cultivating our garden, yes, well, I don't know if you remember the bit of Voltaire, I think it's in Candide, where he has this discussion with a Turk who he thinks is kind of very well dressed and very affluent, and he said, "You must have a vast estate, to kind of dress like this." And the Turk says, "Well, no, actually, I've only got 20 acres." But with that, I can avoid the vices of laziness, and I don't go hungry, and so on, right? Just with 20 acres, with my work, and if I husband that land properly. But when I grew up, I was taught that as an admission that all one did in life was cultivate one's own garden. If you said that about somebody, they were supposed to be selfish. They just looked after themselves in their own garden and ignored the rest of the world. So you can see how this kind of this dualistic, this mainstream view of humans and the land and the earth and so on comes in and takes actually a story which in itself is quite subversive of all that, and turns it inside out, and then you learn it as a kid as, oh, well, you mustn't just be interested in your own garden because that's being horrible to everybody else. So it's just an example of how intimate the struggle against this dominant epistemology is. And it's not just about ideas, it's about stuff that actually happens on the land, is happening in the Ukraine. I mean, it's very, very all too bloodily material. So I just wanted to signal that there are these counter currents in the way people are thinking about this now.
Yes, and the question is also what you do. How do you look after land? What's involved in that? And one of the things that the Kogi are most anxious to demonstrate in the project that we're doing now is the importance of not doing very much to the land. The land knows about the land, and you have to listen to it and act with care and not intervene in any way when it's not required by the land itself that you do that. You don't improve the land will improve itself. You don't heal the land will heal itself, but you have to be its helper. And they're very careful about the subordination of the human action to the demands of the territory itself. Listening to land is really important for them. Now, the techniques they use are things I have not discussed at all, and I don't think I probably should, but they are to do with divination, ways of communicating with land, which are things that is a whole separate subject.
Right. Well, can we now open it up a bit? I'm just going to check the, so please do use the chat facility. I think we've got a couple of questions here. So we've got something from David Haley. It says, there are so many connections to Feng Shui and dragon lines. Learning culture is fundamental to our existence and learning with others. If we stop to think, in inverted commas, we understand that the life of rocks, we understand the life of rocks. The question is the Ant published work on the connection with mountains? I'm not quite sure about that. I think he's talking about the book that the Kogi have made but don't want to be published.
I don't understand the question, I'm sorry.
Well, let me just try and, question is, oh, sorry, well, have you published anything which explores the Kogi connection with the mountains?
I wrote a book about the making of the first film, which is called From the Heart of the World.
Put that in the chat facility, Alan. I think people would like to know about that.
Okay, yes. I'm not going to be very good at this. But if you go onto the website, the Tyrona Trust website, tyronatrust.org, that would be one way of finding it. It's available through Amazon and that sort of way. It's called From the Heart of the World. Look it up under my name. The central feature of that book was my own journey, the journey that the Kogi took me on. And a great deal of the book is concerned with my problem with being confronted with a culture which I have great admiration for, but very little sympathy for. Perhaps this is part of my not quite good enough hippie quality. I'm not necessarily an enthusiast for a society of all-powerful men who never get things wrong, of being in a world in which it's difficult to ask questions. So there are things about that kind of society which challenge my notion of what I am supposed to be.
Alan, didn't you suggest in your talk that there was a particular role for powerful and wise women, but that you just weren't admitted to it? I mean,
that's absolutely true, absolutely true. And it's in the relationship with the outside world, it's men who take the role, the dominant role. Yes, women nevertheless have, they have a very different role in the society, and it's not necessarily a role that they're all that happy with, because they don't have, a woman only has an identity as the wife of a man or the daughter of a man. So if her identity as the wife of a man breaks down, she reverts to being the daughter of a man. That's not necessarily terribly comfortable for the woman. A certain amount of my time with the Kogi is invariably spent trying to explain to single mothers that I am not a suitable marriage partner for them or their daughters. They're looking for a way out. So there's that kind of problem. But there's also the problem of intellectual authority, of I am used to asking questions and wanting to get things clear and to challenge. And that is not something which is admired, respected, or desired in Kogi culture. Probably not in many indigenous cultures.
As you could say, that is a bit of the Enlightenment tradition perhaps we need to hold on to. But
yes,
could I actually ask you say a bit how the mamas themselves are recruited? I mean, you said a bit about how they have to spend 18 years in the dark. I don't know what it does to their eyesight, but anyway, how are they recruited? Is it an inherited role?
It's partly lineage.
Right.
Yes, it partly an inherited role. Partly through this process of divination that I mentioned, ways in which the statement is made by the world itself. This baby is destined for this role. It's a process you see taking place in Aluna, where the question of, can you hear what the water is saying? Can you read the bubbles? The bubbles are a basic method of communication. Bubbles in water are a basic method of communication, as are things like the flights of birds. Reading omens and oracles is a very important part of this society, and not one I'm going to recommend.
Right. We have a question here from David Haley. I don't know if, David, if you're with us. I think you are. Do you want to unmute and then you made a statement about rocks and mountains being energy hubs. Do you want to elaborate on that a bit?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yep.
Oh, great. It was connected to my first question, in fact. In Feng Shui, there is much credibility given to the relationship and the connections with mountains. It was very interesting from Alan's presentation, which I must say was absolutely brilliant, that mountains are a key factor, both materially and in terms of earth energy. Candace also mentioned that the mountains that in Hawaii and Hawaiian culture are so dominant. It's not so much a question as a way of trying to connect some of the things you're already mentioning and the universalities that you touched on earlier. It seems that most earth-based cultures have this connection to revering mountains as a source of energy.
A source of energy or a store of knowledge?
Both. Same thing.
Yes, quite. It's interesting how even in the plains of Tibet, the building of mini mountains is terribly important. And of course, mountains are very important. The fact that they were thinking of going to Everest was not blind chance. They were looking for the highest mountain, the most important spot on Earth. Yeah.
And as in Chinese history tells us, he who controls the waters, i.e. the Tibetan plateau, controls the empire.
We're having to draw things to a close, really. We're coming close up to 8 o'clock, and I know I'll probably turn into a approximation of a lizard after 8. But anyway, there's one more question I think we want worth raising here from Elizabeth Oriel. Can you please say a bit more about the Kogi method of listening to land? I know you said a little bit more about that, but have you got anything you'd like to add about?
The Kogi equate listening and learning. What was that phrase they used? To listen is to learn. I kept being instructed in that. In other words, shut up. Pay attention, shut up, keep your mouth shut. Land, it's to do, I don't know. The Kogi, one of the things that the Kogi can do is recover dried up springs. So you go to an area where there is no water, and a mama will make a little hole in the ground at a place where he should make the hole in the ground. And gradually, over a period of time, water will accumulate in that little hole, and he'll make the hole bigger, and more water will accumulate, accompanied by offerings, accompanied by little rituals, until eventually a flow begins and a rivulet appears in what was barren land. It appears to be a miracle. It isn't a miracle. What's happening, I'm very wary of words like spiritual, by the way. What's happening is that the mama knows through all his senses where the water is. Listening is a word for it, but it's also smelling. It's also tasting the air. It's knowing by being part of the land itself, making himself into part of the land. One of the features that I discovered very quickly when I went into the Sierra for the first time was that if I could turn off everything, and when I turned off everything, I knew what was going on around me and became part of it. We can all do this. For some reason, I didn't find it as hard as perhaps some other people do, to just cease. And I was quite shocked when I returned to civilization at how I had to switch off all my senses that were now turned on in order to be able to tolerate it here. If I switch them back on again, as I could do now, and I'm doing it now just because I'm talking about it, I can smell the air, I can taste what's in it, I can feel the discomfort of the comfortable chair that I'm sitting in. I can feel every part of my body and everything around me, but here I'm lucky because I'm in a very, very quiet place. And if I stop talking, I will be able to feel and know what's around me. And then I'll have to shut it off again because it's intolerable. And one of our problems is that we live in a space that we have made intolerable. And so we have to stop hearing, stop smelling, stop tasting, and endure because we have shut down our senses. That's all I can say about listening to the land.
Thank you so much. Well, it's really been an amazing evening, and I really think we really must thank Alan for all the work he's put into this presentation and for sharing with us his work and his knowledge and the insights that he's gained from it. And I think the Kogi couldn't have had a better interlocutor, put it that way. So many thanks to him, also to Candace Fujikane and Bob Gilbert for their contributions and raising a lot of interesting questions. And I hope you all enjoyed and learned as much as I have from this evening. Before we just sign off and say goodbye, I just have to let you know about our next event, which is on April the 20th. And I think we're really coming down to earth, or a certain kind of earth here, because it's entitled Archival Mappings, Tracing the Journeys and Preserving the Stories of Refugees Fleeing Nazi Anti-Semitism and Persecution. So we're getting back to the nightmare that was the 20th century and is continuing into the 21st century. With a project linked to the Wiener Holocaust Library, which is about creating a mapping platform that specializes in this kind of work. So thank you all very much for coming this evening and taking part, and I look forward to seeing you at our next event.
Can I just say, do go to the website, and if you feel like it, do make a contribution. What we're doing is expensive and hard. Thank you. And thank you all for being such a wonderful audience. And thank you, Candice and Bob, for being so helpful. It was terrific. And of course, thanks, Phil. Thank you.
No worries. Okay. See you all again soon. Bye for now.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Alan. That was just amazing.
How nice of you. Thank you.
I must say, in the first couple of minutes, I thought, oh my God, you know, it's not gonna work, but it did. And I mean, you managed it wonderfully. I mean, I think I would have completely panicked with all these different buttons and things to press, but
that's what panic looks like. You saw panic.
And it all gone so smoothly in the tryout, hadn't it?
Yes.
It all worked swimmingly when you tried it out.
Well, I predicted this, did I not? This is the nature of things. They go for you. The machinery goes for the jugular. It spots your weak. It's like a dog. It knows when you're weak and frightened.
Right. Well, I think, Candice, you have to get on with the rest of your day.
And we have to go and get some supper.
Alan, have a well-deserved drink or dinner or something.
Absolutely. We're trying to work out, we're trying to empty as many bottles of Russian standard vodka as we can. A gesture of defiance against the evil.
In what way are you emptying them?
Is there more than one way?
Well, I thought you were pouring them down the sink in protest.
No, we're pouring them down the throat.
How's that a protest?
Because it removes the bottle from the world.
And the drink, yeah.
And the drink.
From the freezer, yes.
Yeah.
They did once say, I think, the transition from socialism to capitalism was alcoholism. So maybe.
Excellent.
I've always been in transition.
It's been an absolute delight. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Well done, Alan. Well done.
Thank you, Jacob.
That was absolutely amazing. I was already enthralled with the whole thing.
I could see you were. It was interesting watching your face. I thought you were actually quite captivated.
Yeah, I really was.
Nice.
That was fantastic.
Thank you.
All right.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
And it's lovely to work with you again.
Lovely. Yeah. So
See you.
wonderful to see you all.
Yeah.
Take care.
Thank
Thank you.
Bye for now.
Bye.